take the microphone after Barbara Bush. Thanks. No, seriously, what a pleasure and a privilege to be here today. Just a huge thank you to Global Health Corps and of course to Stanford for making this possible. And what an honor to be addressing a group like this. There's a lot of heart in this room. Just over a year ago, my mother passed away. We had about 3 weeks in between her cancer diagnosis and her death, so it all happened pretty quickly. It also came right on the heels of my elderly grandfather passing and a dear uncle also taken by cancer, all in a matter of 6 weeks. Suffice it to say, it was a difficult time. I was 30 years old when my mother died, older than some, younger than others. No matter how much perspective I attempted to maintain, including harboring such thoughts as, "You have not been abducted by ISIS or sold into sexual slavery by Boko Haram," the grief was unabating, relentless, and unavoidable. Doing the work that so many in this room and on this stage do, we tend to be familiar with concepts like self-care and burnout, even embracing vulnerability. I definitely was. I've been working on issues that might broadly fall under the category of human security, with a particular focus on sexual violence, really since high school. As such, I'm very familiar with phrases like self-care. When and if brought up, I would be the first to affirm how important it is, how one must be kind and in tune with oneself in the face of work that can often bring agonizing realities and hardships to your door daily. I would vehemently encourage others to take care of themselves, share my thoughts on how exercise and journaling really help. I believed all these things cerebrally. I did many of these things: exercise, journal, confide in friends. But never had I been able to truly sit with and acknowledge the hardships swirling around me, to take what I knew cerebrally and experience it emotionally. At the end of the day, it tended to be easier to buy a plane ticket, write an angry op-ed, volunteer, or organize. When you keep moving and you stay busy, engaged, challenged, it's easier to avoid what might be sitting patiently, stubbornly, just beneath the skin. I'm what some might refer to as a third culture kid. Born in Vermont, I was raised moving around overseas as the daughter of a UN World Food Program employee. My family and I live primarily in the developing world, and I spent ages 12 to 18 in Pakistan. I tend to attribute that time to when I really cultivated what has become a lifelong interest in the hardships women and girls around the world face, and their incredible capacity in the face of those hardships. So I always knew more or less what interested me topically. Namely issues around gender and violence. I wasn't sure exactly how I wanted to address them. I also struggled, along with many of my peers, with the somewhat standard paradigm of development work. The fact that I'm a white, privileged North American working in a field that tended to be dominated by other white, privileged individuals didn't sit quite right and didn't reflect the vision I had for this work. Becoming a Global Health Corps Fellow in 2013 offered a completely different paradigm. Here was an organization that was partnering young people from really different geographical and cultural backgrounds to address huge issues of inequity, both here in the US and in East Africa. I also love the idea that Global Health Corps embraced the passion and the creativity of young professionals, and young professionals coming from a wide variety of sector expertise. During my fellowship year, as Barbara just mentioned, I had the privilege to serve as a communications and advocacy officer with a public-private partnership called Together for Girls. Together for Girls brings together UN agencies, the US government, and the private sector to collect data on physical, sexual, and emotional violence against children. They work with governments to use that data to both prevent and respond to the violence, and then finally they raise awareness about the global pandemic that is violence against children. At Together for Girls, we released the first ever digital magazine addressing sexual violence called Sept. Among other things, the magazine championed survivors that had come forward with their stories, allowing other survivors to see that they're not alone and to see that overcoming such a trauma is possible. During that same time, I was also volunteering at the DC Rape Crisis Center. It was my attempt to keep at least one foot in the community where I was living and where these issues that I was advocating around were happening every day. So growing up being surrounded by hardship and then immersing yourself so completely in issues like rape and violence against children can take its toll, and I knew that. Again, I knew when to go for a run or to call a friend. But I'm part of a generation that has been told that to be someone, to be worth something, you have to be busy, you have to produce, you must achieve and climb ladders and power through and grit your teeth and carry on. You should be published, speak at conferences, and have a bajillion Twitter followers. And even though I would at times scoff at that mentality, the reality is that I was still kind of taking part in the hustle, and maybe even using it to block out the sadness and the pain that I was hearing about almost every day. Until I lost one of the most important people in my life. That's when grief stepped in and stripped me of my ability to pretend. It took all of my intricately designed coping mechanisms and escapisms and rendered them completely ineffectual. I was the most vulnerable I have ever been in my whole life. Grief strong-armed me to take in a beat. I had just started a new job that I was growing to love. I had a gym membership and a partner to go home to every day. That was it. No blogging, no volunteering, no worrying about my abysmal Twitter following. Just being present, which meant being present with sadness. And for those of us that work in the do-gooder sector, I think there often exists a risk of ignoring your pain for that of others. Again, I've not been a stranger to convincing myself that my pain is nothing compared to that of a rape survivor or a child growing up in a refugee camp. There's that perspective again, which is absolutely valid and offers really important grounding. We should all maintain perspective in times of hardship. But it's disillusionment to convince yourself that because greater pain might exist, that yours doesn't matter. That is what grief taught and is teaching me. I'm finally holding myself with care and not just coping. I want to do more than cope. And in order to do that, I've had to welcome the sadness in, sit with it, understand it, accept it, and when ready, move past it. So when we talk about resilient leadership, I no longer associate it with being the CEO of a company or the president of a country. I think about people who live authentic lives in the face of doubt and tragedy. I think about people who embrace vulnerability instead of running from it and use it for personal growth. I think about people who come forward with their stories and their pain so as to possibly prevent it from happening to somebody else. And I think about people who are filled with empathy for others and still have a little left over for themselves. I now have the pleasure and the joy to work for an organization called Tostan, one that is much like Global Health Corps in that, in my humble opinion, it truly understands what it means to foster leadership and resilience. Working in West Africa, Tostan provides a human rights-based educational program for those who in most cases have never had access to formal education. The program is offered in local languages using traditional African cultural methods of learning like song, theater, poetry, and classes are facilitated by individuals who live in the communities for 3 years and are from the region. So the program essentially provides information and a space for dialogue. It's then up to the communities themselves to envision and then work towards a new future. In other words, Tostan's approach meets people where they are and nurtures strengths they already have. Leadership in this scenario is truly at the community level, and the changes that result are authentic. And I get to tell the stories of these communities. Stories of resilience, communities coming together to address a 2,000-year-old practice like female genital cutting, and then collectively deciding to end their tradition together. Stories of communities stepping in when they witness violence in the home, saying we know our human rights and we are not allowing violence in our communities anymore. Communities voting thousands of women into leadership positions and championing the rights of girls to stay in school. There's a proverb that was told to Molly Melching, our founder, when she started out. A leader is like a Fulani cow herder. Sometimes he will lead the herd from the front. Sometimes he will remain in the middle and be part of the herd. Sometimes he will remain behind, allowing them to move forward, following their lead. Like a skilled cow herder, a good leader knows when to be where. I think about that proverb at times when considering how I can best serve the causes that matter to me and adjust my position based on the circumstances. But I also like to think of it as knowing when to step back, let others take the lead, or maybe even step out altogether. Knowing when to take a beat and a breath. Knowing when to ask for help and admit that you need it. And knowing that resilience often comes through hardship with a life lived in authenticity, a real possibility on the other side. Thank you so much.